Well, movements like this, I think, are made up of, you can sort of think of three different kinds of left. And that social left, the university students, the sort of social justice left, is the one that's at the center of La Nuit Debout. The question is how well they make connections with some of the other parts of the left.
What was your feel going there? Is it like Occupy Wall Street?
It's very much like Occupy Wall Street. There's better food. And there are more cigarettes and there's more beer. But in terms of movement, in terms of the sorts of the ways that people are talking, you get a similar sense that people are very dissatisfied with the political establishment, including the left, but also that there's a populism that can be formed in different ways, right? That has a left sense, but also a sort of libertarian sense as well. And for a movement like this, the early days give you a whole bunch of potential, and what you see is the movement starting to go in one of those numerous different positions that it can go in. So we're starting to see it sort of get an identity, get a set of beliefs behind it.
You
now.
Say it's the early days. Will it be the only days?
Not necessarily. I think about this in terms of Occupy Wall Street, where I spent a good bit of time, and with the Indignados, which I saw in some of the smaller cities in Spain when that was going on. Those had a surprising influence. Occupy developed a bunch of other organizations. Occupy Sandy during the hurricane in New York actually put some of the everyday work into effect. But what you also see is a long-term effect, even in electoral politics. I would say that the Sanders-Trump election is playing out a lot of the themes that Occupy brought up, and certainly Podemos came out of Indignados. So even a group that says that they don't want to do electoral political work ends up influencing the political scene long term.
But of course, the difference with Spain or the United States is that their people are used to grassroots politics a lot more. Here in France, we expect things to come from the top down.
That's one of the things that's interesting to me, is that you're right. Places like the United States, Spain, Italy have a sort of anarchist, a gut anarchist tradition, a suspicion of power and hierarchy in the state, whereas even left movements in France have been much more connected to the state, right? You can have a socialist president in a way that we never have in the United States. So I think that it was surprising to see that. And again, in those early days, La Nuit Debout was trying to figure out what its relationship to labor movement, the labor unions would be. And initially, they intentionally kept them at bay so that they could develop on their own. What we're seeing today, and in fact, what's supposed to be going on as we speak, is a public discussion between the labor unions and La Nuit Debout to see if they can develop some sort of an understanding that may determine whether it's a more traditionally French labor allied movement or something in the American tradition.
I was going to say, because there's a bit of schizophrenia there, you're describing this as an incubator for perhaps a fundamental change in the way politics is done. But what those demonstrators that were marching in Paris today were for was to keep things the way they are.
Well, it's interesting. There was the front of the protest and the rest of the protest. I started off in the middle and was talking to labor unions, and the first thing on everybody's list was La Loi Travail, right? The labor law reforms.
Just scrap the bill, no reform.
Exactly. Labor union members would then go into specifics in their particular industry. So if they were in the entertainment industry, they were worried about the changes that are being proposed at the Odeon Theater. If they were at airports, if they were in industry, they were talking about specifics there. When you got to the front of the protest and you were talking to younger protesters associated with La Nuit Debout, they were also talking about La Loi Travail right off the bat, the labor law, but then very quickly went in a broader direction, right? They're talking about a social vision. From the early days, they were talking about rewriting the Constitution, about replacing the government, about a radical sort of a change. Part of the challenge will be in starting with that commonality about the labor law and then figuring out what both these groups want in common and whether there's a way to make some common ground there.
Excuse me for saying this, but it reminds people here of what happened in 1968 in France, where it started as this protest against the way society works, against our society of consumption, and it ended with trade union demands being met, basically material trade union demands.
I wonder if it'll be the same thing, and I think that there are two important sets of negotiations coming up for the activists in La Nuit Debout. First is with the labor unions to see what that relationship will be, and they seem to want to be allied with elements of the labor movement but maintain their independence. The second part is what you might call in the American context the civil rights left. Immigrants, people in the banlieue, people of color, people who have largely been excluded from the sorts of union jobs that those unionists are worried about. And the question is whether La Nuit Debout, like Occupy Wall Street, can figure out how to integrate those sorts of concerns with their movement. If they can, they become considerably more powerful and are not just a shadow of the labor movement, if they can't figure out how to integrate the concerns of people who have been at the margins both of the labor movement but also the universities that you're talking about La Nuit Debout coming out from, then they have a smaller base, and then they're going to be locked in a more sort of conventional political moment.
All right.